Hi folks, welcome back to Newton Community Farm. This is our YouTube channel and it's Wednesday, which means that we're going to talk a bit about farming and gardening. My name's Hope, if I haven't met you here before, otherwise welcome back. And today our topic is no-till farming and gardening. And if you haven't heard the term no-till, it's a relatively trendy word that's gaining some more momentum in the field of agriculture and farming. But it's definitely nothing new. Cultures have been not tilling the land for centuries, and since industrialized agriculture, we've began tilling quite a bit more and relying on tillage much more intensely. So before we dive into everything no-till, we'll stop and define tillage. So what tillage is, we have a little visual representation of some sort today. This is just a little container of soil. So tillage is what happens to the soil when we plow it. So this is from our worm bin, so there's a lot of eggshells and worms in it. So if we can imagine that this is a layer of soil in a garden bed or a farm bed, and we can imagine that this is some kind of a plow or some kind of like a mechanized machine, it'll come through and kind of dig up the soil mechanically. And what that does, that's positive for the farmer or whoever's cultivating the land, is it breaks up the top layer of soil and it prepares it for planting, which in the short term is beneficial. It can save time, it's less manual labor, but in the long term it does degrade the soil health. So it breaks up those microscopic systems that the soil builds, and it tends to kill off some of the organic matter, kills off some earthworms, tends to just damage the overall well-being of the soil. And the impact that that has is the soil is more prone to erosion. The soil is less able to retain water, and it's easier to see, we tend to see more runoff of water and chemical inputs into nearby streams and rivers. So there are not only impacts on the land that we're tilling, but also on the surrounding communities and environments. So that's a general definition and visual representation of tilling. And tilling is not, there are various degrees of tilling. So there are plows, which sometimes are like the deepest, most invasive machines for tilling. And then there are things like spaders or BCS mowers or more shallow tilling, which doesn't do as much damage, but over time can tend to degrade the soil systems. So if you're working on a farm or if you have your own garden and you're thinking about how to optimize your soil health, a good thing to think about is how can you either reduce or eliminate tillage. So at Newton Community Farm, we use a very non-invasive machine for tilling, but every year we have a rotating number of beds that we do not till. So we give different chunks of our land a break each season. So today we'll just walk to the two areas of the farm where we have our no-till beds, and we'll be able to take a look at how we do no-till here and how you can potentially adopt no-till in your growing space. So when we talk about no-till, it doesn't really just have to do with the machines that we are or are not using. It also has to do with how we interact with the soil on a general level. So when we're thinking about tilling, not tilling, optimizing soil health, there are three terms that we can remember. And they're the 3 C's of taking care of our soil. So that's cover, that's cycle, and it's compost. So those are the 3 C's that we have. And cover means not leaving the soil bare. So not leaving it open without any kind of root structure or any kind of covering over it. If we leave the soil bare, soil can wash away with rain, it can blow away with wind, and we're losing that healthy topsoil that we're probably building up season to season if you're taking good care of your soil and adding compost and things like that. So keeping your soil covered. So how do we do that? We do that with cover crops. So in the winter time, when the growing season has quieted and we're getting ready for colder weather and we're not seeing as much production, rather than not planting into the soil and leaving it bare, what we do at the farm and what you can do at home and in your growing space is to plant cover crop. So that's crops that we're not planting for production and harvest, but just crops that are replenishing nutrients into the soil, and they're not being harvested. They're just there for the interim until we're planting cash crop again, or harvestable crop again. Cover can also be a layer of mulch over your bed if you're not quite ready to plant something into it yet. Rather than leaving it bare and exposed to the elements, you can cover it with a layer of mulch or leaves or some kind of a bedding for the meantime, so that soil can stay where you want it to be. And then another option for cover is something that you might see if you drive by a farm in the winter. If you've ever driven by a farm in the winter or visited a farm in the winter, or even a community garden in the winter, you might see dead plants that have been left in beds or in the soil. And the reason for that is, rather than leaving your soil bare, and even if you didn't have time to plant cover crops, leaving your plants as they die in the soil is a good way to keep some kind of a root structure in place to hold the soil right where you want it to be. So that's cover. So let's talk a little bit about another C, which is cycle. And this is another way, regardless of tilling or not tilling, to keep your soil nice and healthy and to keep all the nutrients in your soil that you want. So with cycle, that's relevant when we're planting. So when we're planting in the growing season and when we're thinking about transitioning from one crop in the bed to another crop, maybe midway through the growing season, we want to think about not planting the same family of crops over and over and over in the same space, because two closely related crops, so for example, kale and broccoli are in the same family. So if we're planting kale and then we're planting broccoli, both of those crops are going to deplete from the soil the same nutrient, or the same set of nutrients. So rather than continuing to ask that the soil give us those nutrients, and depleting the nutrients of the soil of those nutrients, we can cycle through different crops and different crop families and plant those and kind of give the soil a break from providing one nutrient and asking from it to provide another nutrient to keep that balance going in the soil. So we've covered cover, we've covered cycle, and then there's compost. So compost is really relevant when we're starting the season out. If we're uncovering a bed at the end of winter, or pulling out or mowing over our cover crop at the end of winter, we might want to give our soil a little TLC before we start planting into it for the growing season, and spread a layer of compost on top. And that might be something that you do in the spring, or that you do repeatedly throughout the growing season. But compost is another way to support your soil health. So we have those 3 C's, and they're relevant to no-till, because if we are not tilling our land, or if we're not disturbing the soil structures of our gardens, we are going to think about replacing that activity with some other activities to keep our soil healthy and looking and acting the way we want it to. So if we're introducing those 3 techniques, we'll see improvement in our soil health as we remove the tilling from the picture. So at the farm here, we do varieties of those 3 things. So we're always thinking about cycling our crops. So, not planting one thing after the other, not planting onions repeatedly in the same place, but rather moving them over here in one season and over to the other side of the farm in another season. And we're always introducing compost to the system, and we're always using cover crop in the wintertime. And if we're not planting immediately into a bed, we're covering it with something. But usually, because we're such a small farm and we put out so much food, the beds are all pretty much full. And those 3 C's are relevant at different points of the season, so they're kind of seasonal and secular in that regard. So we're thinking about compost in the spring at the beginning of the growing season. We're thinking about cycling throughout the growing season, and we're thinking about cover all the time, but really particularly in between growing seasons. So we're coming up on our first example of no-till growing, and these are our no-till tomatoes. So this entire section of the farm, where you see the wooden posts and the green plants, this is a section that's getting its rest this season. So this land hasn't been tilled at all. And the mulch that you see is actually the cover crop that we planted last year and that we mowed over this season to be planted into with these tomato seedlings. So we haven't used any kind of machinery for the length of the season on this piece of land, on this piece of the farm. And because we were able to mow over the cover crop, we created this nice layer of cover. And the cover crop, as we mowed it, it died and it formed this nice layer of mulch. And then we were able to dig into this layer of mulch and into the soil at intervals where we'd want our tomato plants to be. I believe we did 18 inches, and put a little bit of compost in the hole, planted the seedling in the hole, and covered it right back up. So while we did do a bit of digging, it was not very deep at all, and and it allowed us to put the plant right into the soil. So if you see here, all of this soil around the base of the tomato plant hasn't been disturbed this season, and it's getting a break as it kind of replenishes its soil composition and kind of takes a rest, really, while it's still providing nutrients to the tomato. It's getting a rest from the minimal tillage that we do here at the farm. So that's one way to approach tilling. So one way to approach no-till, if you're thinking about introducing it to your garden. And even if you have a small growing space and you're not using like a plow or a big piece of machinery, no-till can actually reduce the amount of work that you'll have to do in the long run in your growing space. And it'll take some time to build up to that minimal amount of work. In the beginning, transitioning to completely no-till can be challenging, and it can take a little while. And as you'll see in the next bed, sometimes the layer of mulch, weeds will still come up, and there'll still be a lot of maintenance to do around your land. But for the most part, once you start no-till, it can kind of reduce the overall amount of work that you'll be doing in your garden. So whether you're a big operation or small, you can definitely benefit from introducing some no-till practices. So our next example that we're coming up on shortly is another area of the farm that's no-till. It's a single bed, and this is where our garlic was planted just a few weeks ago. We harvested that, and that had been growing in the soil since last fall, and it was covered with a layer of mulch. The garlic grew up through the mulch, and we harvested it, and then we planted right into that layer of mulch this season. So this bed has not been, so it's this one next door. So this bed has not been plowed at all this season, but because we had this nice layer of mulch, we planted right into this bed. So you can see we're still working on making this bed productive and, weed free, but this is what you can expect if you're introducing no-till for the first time to your garden. So the squash plants, it's very hot, so they're definitely a little bit heat sensitive right now. But you can see, this layer of mulch has been down since last fall. We dug up the garlic and we planted the squash seedlings right into the holes that the garlic had been growing in. So that's a crop cycle, that's a crop rotation. It's a different family of crops going into the soil. The soil is covered and it hasn't been dug up, and it has this nice layer of mulch over the whole entire thing that doesn't have a plant in it. We'll have to go through and weed every now and then, but for the most part, the maintenance on this bed is a lot lower than it would be if it weren't covered with a layer of mulch. And yeah, we also did the same thing here with adding a scoop of compost into each hole, just to kind of give it a little bit of a boost between crops. And these are still small, but they haven't been in the soil for too long. And these are particularly small, but if we walk down a few, we can see that some of these have taken even a little bit better and they're starting to sprout up. So just pretty good examples of, crops that are growing just fine in land that hasn't been, disturbed, and it's in soil that hasn't been, broken up and laid back on top of itself. Giving your land a rest and letting it take some time to rebuild those soil structures that are so beneficial for plant and plant health. Even while the land's resting, we can see this kind of growth. So if you're thinking about introducing a less invasive, more no-till philosophy into your growing space, know that you can still produce and know that plants can still grow happily in your growing space, for sure. So these are the two examples that we have going on in the farm. And even as you can see down here, the land has been so minimally moved that we still have some leftover signs of our garlic harvest in this bed that was home to the garlic. And so next season, this bed will not be a designated no-till bed, but rather another bed that has been, where the soil has been disturbed to some degree. We will, we'll rotate these no-till beds so that another bed gets a break, and that another bed gets to be resting for part of the season at least. So that's the general philosophy with no-till. It's all about minimal soil disruption and allowing the soil structures and all those microscopic systems and fungi and all of that to continue to grow and flourish. And over time, with less soil disruption, farmers and gardeners alike, really any scale of growing, we'll begin to see, more soil health, more nutrients in the soil, and soil that's more able to hold on to water and even sequester more carbon and add more, more of a reservoir for a healthier ecosystem all around. And the added benefit as well is that, the healthier your soil is, and this applies to home gardeners and, big scale farmers alike, the healthier your soil is, the less you'll have to rely on chemical inputs or some kind of synthetic fertilizer. For big operations, for like hundreds of acre farms, when the soil is plowed intensely year after year, repeatedly throughout the season, year after year, those farmers and those organizations will have to rely more on chemical input and synthetic fertilizer to get those same yields year after year. So if we're thinking about longevity and sustainability of our agriculture systems, it's important to think about, think from the ground up. Like, soil health is first and foremost, and healthier soil is healthier plants, and it's going to be a healthier agriculture system as a whole. So that's the gist of no-till. And you know, let us know if you're working on it in your garden this year. And as always, we'll be back here next Wednesday for another episode. Take care. Bye, everybody.